Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another video of History by Podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Lydia McGrew. Today we're discussing her book, The Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage. Dr. Lydia McGrew is a widely published analytic philosopher and author. She received her PhD in English from Vanderbilt University in 1995. She has published extensively in the theory of knowledge, specializing in formal epistemology and in its application to the evaluation of testimony and to the philosophy of religion. She defends the reliability of the Gospels and Acts in several books, including The Eye of the Beholder, The Gospel of John as Historical Reportage, and Testimonies to the Truth, Why You Can Trust the Gospels. So welcome to the show, Lydia.
Thanks, Jacob. Thank you for having me.
Of course, thank you for joining me. So let's start off with this question. Typically, very often in scholarship regarding the Gospel of John, they usually dismiss it as, oh, it's super late, it's maybe even 2nd century, and it may or may not have used the synoptics as sources. And some say that maybe there was a science gospel, but I do have a question about that I'll get to later. But I want to start off with this. What is the main reason you believe that the Gospel of John is a historical report about the ministry of Jesus?
So the short and undetailed version of that is that the main reason I believe it is because there are so many reasons to believe it. That's a kind of short, non-specific answer. But I am actually serious about that answer. So the slightly longer version of that is that there are so many different types of reasons to take the Gospel of John to be historical. For example, external and internal evidence. And then there are types within those types. So within the external evidence, there are reasons from geography, from culture, from little notes about places and things that have been discovered by archaeology. And then within the internal evidence category, there are marks of verisimilitude within the document. There are crosshatchings with the synoptics. There are similarities in terms of Jesus' personality across all of the Gospels. So there are, sections of reasons and then sections within those sections. And when all of that points in one direction, we need to start sitting up and taking notice. And that's what I believe we have in the Gospel of John.
Does the Gospel of John overlap and relate to the Synoptic Gospels or not really?
So I would take overlap to be one thing and relating to be another thing. I don't know if that's how you intended it, but overlapping would be the sort of common concept of actually telling the same things. So there is some overlap. There are incidents like the feeding of the 5,000 that are in both, though John tells it in his own way. But perhaps more interestingly than overlap is relating. John relates to the synoptics in these very interesting ways of, for example, mutual explanation, where what John says will casually explain what we find in the synoptics and vice versa. What the synoptics say will happen to explain what we find in John, but it's up to us to sort of notice that. And that's what I've called the undesigned coincidences. Or they'll relate to one another in that you'll see the same personality of Jesus coming out, or similar ways of speaking, or that kind of thing, so that they're relating to one another in these fruitful ways. But it just seems to be arising from the fact that they're both telling the truth, not so much from their telling the very same thing.
And one of the reasons I asked that is because some will point out that the Gospel of John's version of the trial of Jesus, for example, appears to be very different from the way the synoptics talk about it. Some will go as far as saying these actually contradict one another. What do you make of that?
No, I don't see any contradiction there at all. it really depends on the specific claim of contradiction that someone is making, what the answer would be. One of the most famous is the claim that John contradicts the synoptics as far as what day of the month Jesus' crucifixion took place. And I don't actually see that. In fact, I see them as agreeing with one another. For example, they both agree that it was Friday. They both portray it as coming after Jesus actually ate the Passover with his disciples. And it's only when you start delving into the claim of contradiction that you start realizing how far-fetched it is. That, for example, John is supposed to have implied in this super roundabout way that it was a different day of the month in order to liken Jesus to the Passover lamb, even though he never mentions a Passover lamb, which is a little weird. Um, so it's not, um, it, it's different, but not contradictory. And that's what's so cool, actually. In fact, there's even one of these undesigned coincidences concerning Jesus being heard by Pontius Pilate. Well, there's a couple of them actually, but I'll just give one. Um, in Luke, Pilate is told that Jesus is a rabble rouser, that he's committing sedition against the Romans, very serious charge to a Roman governor. And he goes back and asks Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said, "Well, you said it," which could either mean yes or just, I'm not going to answer you. And then he goes back out to the people and he says, "I find no fault in this man." Very strange. Like, how does that answer lead him to render that conclusion? Well, when you go over to the Gospel of John, they actually have a further conversation, and Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. For if it were, my servants would fight." And so the idea is that Pilate realized he's, from Pilate's perspective, just a harmless religious crank. And that's why he goes out and says, "I find no fault in him." So they complement one another in that really interesting way, where Luke is raising a question and John is, in a sense, answering that question. So that's what we find in multiple places, actually, in John and the Synoptics.
What does the Gospel of John tell us about Jesus that the synoptics do not?
Well, he tells us incidents, of course, that are different, like the healing of the blind man, the man who was born blind. It's only found in John. There are other incidents that are unique to John. The raising of Lazarus is only found in John. So, in that sense, he tells us things about Jesus in that sense that are found only in John. And I think that's deliberate. I think John didn't want to just repeat, it's like that's been done already. They got that covered, right? I don't want to just be saying the same things over and over again. What about this? You guys didn't tell about that. I'm going to tell about that. So I think that's unique, but that doesn't call his truthfulness into account at all, or into question at all. Um, but also, he tells us about times when Jesus said similar things that are just in different places. But that's very believable. So, for example, in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "Ask and it shall be given you, seek and you shall find, knock and it shall be open." That's in Matthew 7. But in John, it's there's a later time when he's speaking to them on the night of the Last Supper, and he says, "Up till now, you've asked nothing in my name. Ask, and you shall receive." So it's a very similar saying, and there's no reason to doubt that Jesus would have said similar things on different occasions. Sometimes these same sayings are even repeated in the same synoptic gospel, that he said something similar twice. Um, but what it shows you is this same Jesus, that it's the same Jesus, that this is the way his mind worked. Or we find him making plays on words in the synoptics, and then he'll make a similar but different play on words in the Gospel of John. So that's what I find so cool, that he tells us things about Jesus that we don't find in the synoptics, but they're things that fit with what we find out about Jesus in the synoptics.
Who do you think that the beloved disciple the Gospel of John speaks of is?
Well, I think he's definitely the author. I think he was a personal disciple of Jesus. And I think he remembered these things and wrote about them later on. I think he's clearly a Jew. He's clearly knowledgeable about the circumstances uh, prior to the fall of Jerusalem. He's just deeply immersed, embedded in that culture, and has an astonishing memory. Really, not beyond the bounds of possibility, but just a very remarkable memory for happenings and little vivid physical details and so forth, and that he just was especially close to Jesus.
Who do you think that the beloved disciple most likely is? Because I know that some will say, "Oh, John, son of Zebedee," and you got some like Charles Worth who think it's Thomas, or some others that think he's Lazarus. There's many different suggestions about who this guy might have been. I think there's even some that think it's Mary Magdalene. What are your thoughts on that?
I think he was definitely John, the son of Zebedee. And I noticed that you had, other questions on that. So I was, kind of waiting to come out with that. Um, in fact, that's the unanimous attestation of the external evidence, um, is that he was, John. And and I think it's very clear that those early church fathers mean that John, the John that's named, that we know to have been a disciple of Jesus. Um, so uh, these other suggestions, in my opinion, are just they're very far fetched, and they probably of them, the only one that has anything to commend them is Richard Bauckham's idea that it was a different disciple named John. But and I have a section on that in my book, The Eye of the Beholder. I have actually a chapter and an appendix on authorship, but I think even Bauckham has to strain to try to make out that it was this other person named John. But as far as it's being some, completely different person like Lazarus, there's just no evidence to that effect at all, really, in my opinion, none worth speaking of, to counter the external evidence. And then, as far as the internal evidence, I think it's very clear that it was a member of the 12, in which case it really has to be John, the son of Zebedee, because there is only one John who's a member of the 12. I even have some unique arguments in the appendix for its being a member of the 12, arguments that in all my reading of the literature I haven't seen anywhere else. So I'll give people the opportunity to get the book and read those if they're interested. But I don't. I just don't see any reasonable alternative to its being the son of Zebedee.
Why do you think that the identity of the beloved disciple was obscured?
So it depends on what one means by that. In one sense, I don't believe it was obscured. So, for example, when you go to the very last couple of verses in chapter 21, right there at the very end, I think just those couple of verses are by um, another person, just that little bit. And it says, this is the disciple that wrote these things, and we know that what he says is true. So, you know, they're not going to say that if they have no idea who he was. So I think that right there is really strong evidence that they did know who he was. Now, if what one means is, he's using this phrase, the beloved disciple, instead of a name or instead of speaking in the first person. So I'll deal with the first person issue. Um, Actually, not uncommon at all to find third person narrative, uh, third person references of the author to himself. We find this, for example, in Xenophon's Anabasis. And this is a point that even St. Augustine commented on in his Contra Faustum. So that's not really an issue at all. Now, as to why he used that phrase, the beloved disciple, I think we're just going to be guessing, we're just going to be conjecturing. But one conjecture is that that is how he was known. So, you know, So, for example, Peter is, known as Simon Peter, Peter the Rock, or there'll be these little epithets, or Thomas, who was known as the twin. So people would have these extra little terms that were used to refer to them, especially if their name was common. And the name John was somewhat common at that time. So I think he may have been known as the disciple for whom Jesus had a special affection, the disciple Jesus loved, that kind of thing. And then that was important to him, that was meaningful to him. And so he refers to himself in those terms. That would be my guess, but I don't think it actually obscured his identity from his original audience.
So, which one of the Johns do you think wrote the Gospel of John? Because I know that some people think it's John the Evangelist. Oh, it's John the Apostle, like also known as John son of Zebedee. Oh, it's actually John of Patmos or John of Ephesus. It just keeps going.
Well, I think several of those were actually the same person. So I think John the son of Zebedee lived in Ephesus later on in his life and was exiled to Patmos and all of that. And that's all one person. It's important to realize that the idea that there were two completely different people, one of them being John the son of Zebedee, one of them being so-called John the Elder, is itself open to question. It is not absolute. There's literally one passage in Papias on which that is based, and it's not the only reasonable reading of that passage. If there were in fact two different people, John the son of Zebedee and John the Elder, then I think it was the son of Zebedee who wrote it, but those may not even have been two different people even there. The other thing that there is some confusion about, I even found in an article by no less a scholar than Ben Witterington, that he was actually making a blunder on this. There are those who think that Papias said that John the Elder wrote the Gospel of John. We have nothing still extant written by Papias in which he directly addresses the authorship of the Gospel. There's a preface reported in kind of a, Papias said that such and such, like a second order way, where he actually is saying it was John, and appears to be saying John, the son of Zebedee, but we don't have any actual document. We know we've lost works by Papias, but there's no place where he says that this other guy wrote the gospel. That's just not there. So there literally is not a single church father that articulates any alternative opinion. And then there's a bunch of them that say that it was written by John, the son of Zebedee. Here's just one interesting little bit that I don't think I've ever seen anyone else say this, that I point out in the book. In chapter 21, we find these 7 people all going out all night in a boat. And because Peter says he's going fishing, and they go with him, and the beloved disciple is one of them. And when people try to make out that the beloved disciple was someone other than the son of Zebedee, they'll sometimes have the theory that he was from Jerusalem, he wasn't a fisherman, etc. He didn't travel all that much. And so there's this question, in that case, why was he so eager to go out in a little dinky fishing boat all night long? Like, hey, let's see, that ought to be a fun experience. Never done that before. Whereas it makes a lot of sense, of course, if he was the son of Zebedee, he was already, a fisherman. So this portrayal of him as kind of an upper crust Jerusalem landlubber doesn't fit as well with that passage as his being, the son of Zebedee.
Some scholars think that the Gospel of John was written in compositional stages. What do you think about this?
Well, the way that's usually cast is something I would disagree with. So the way that's usually cast is in terms of there being these separate passages that are sources, and then you have this late editor who comes along and he sort of stitches them together. And I don't think there's any good evidence for that at all. The furthest I would go would be that chapter 21 is, to my mind, clearly written by the same author as the rest of the book. But, he may have finished through chapter 20, which ends in a way that kind of feels like an ending. And then, it could have just been even a couple weeks later. He said to himself, "Oh man, I wanted to tell that story about Jesus appearing at the Sea of Galilee. I'm gonna go ahead and add that." You could call that a compositional stage if you wanted to, but uh, the more elaborate idea of stitching together by a later editor and there being like these layers and so forth, I think that's just a sort of a scholarly delusion. It's an over complex hypothesis that I don't think the evidence warrants.
When do you think that the Gospel of John was most likely written?
So I have a really generous time span during which it could have been written. The most important thing is it was written during the lifetime of the person who wrote it. Now that's kind of tautology, but what I mean is it was written during the lifetime of a personal disciple of Jesus who whose memories are from, the ministry of Jesus in that temple period when the city of Jerusalem was still standing and so forth forward. So I think it could have been written as early as the 60s or as late as the 90s, but by that man. He would have just been older, obviously, if it was written later. But I think the evidence is pretty strong that he still had all his faculties very much intact. So I was discussing this with someone recently who definitely thinks it was written before the fall of Jerusalem. And I said some of these things to him, like, well, it's clearly from within the memory of someone who's very familiar with Jewish culture and Jerusalem before the fall of Jerusalem, but that doesn't mean that he wrote it down before the fall of Jerusalem. And this person said to me, well, but sometimes when you say it was written after AD 70, fall of Jerusalem, people just kind of shut off. They just let that phrase do their thinking for them. And so he said, we want to be careful about that, not to say, well, it doesn't matter if it was written before or after AD 70, because then people will, in a sense, stop listening and they'll say, okay, then maybe it was really late. It was certainly not written in the second century. That is something I don't like appealing to the consensus of scholarship, but I would say in this case, even some of the more that we might think of as liberal or mainstream scholars have abandoned that, and for good reason. Um, the discovery of the P-52 fragment, and it had to travel, all the way to a place far away and so forth. Definitely not second century, at the latest, late first century, but might have been as early as the 60s. If I'm going to kind of drop a pin on a time in between there, maybe around 85. Might have been when he was in Ephesus later on and started thinking about the fact that he was the last living eyewitness and wanted to get some of these things down and make sure that they weren't forgotten after he died.
Do you believe in a signed gospel source for John? If so, do you think John himself wrote it earlier and later incorporated it into his gospel?
No, I don't think there's a signed source at all. And one of the interesting things there is the artificiality of trying to come up with 7 signs. It's really interesting to watch people do this because if you count too many of them, oh, now we don't have 7 anymore, And then if you count too few of them, oh, now we don't have 7 anymore because it's too few. And so it ends up being really arbitrary. So, you know, for example, do you count Jesus walking on the water as one of the signs? Do you count the resurrection as one of the signs? Do you count only miracles? Some people would count the cleansing of the temple as being one of them. Well, then you're definitely going to have too many. I was talking with someone about this who thinks not so much that there was a signed source, but that he was building it around 7 signs. And he said to me, "Well, there are 7-ish signs." And I'm like, "Well, then you're just fudging, right? Either there are definitely 7 because the number 7 is important to him, or there aren't." And I would say there aren't. Um, and so, no, I don't I think, again, that's one of those redactive layer conjectures that there's no real reason for. Once you start recognizing the marks of memoir in this gospel, and that freshness of memory, and casualness of his way of just describing true things, then you can kind of break free of all of these, oh, there are seams here where he's editing together his sources, or there's an earlier signed source, signed gospel, and instead you start picturing this person sitting there talking, maybe someone else, writing it down from his dictation as he talks, and having just these unexplained allusions, these little bits that he drops and then he doesn't uh, quite finish them out. Like, what was the dispute in chapter 3 about purification? Just the way that your father might tell something, or your grandfather might tell something that he remembers from earlier in his life, and that actually makes a lot more sense of the evidence, I believe.
What does Papias tell us about the Gospel of John? And I also want to ask an additional question on top of that. What do you think about the claim by the Anti-Marcionite Prologue that Papias wrote down the Gospel of John when he was being dictated the Gospel by John?
Right. Well, so as I mentioned earlier, Papias doesn't tell us anything that we have still. I mean, there's the Anti-Marcionite Prologue, but that isn't written by Papias. It's someone else's claim about something in a work by Papias that we no longer have. So in the works that we currently have, we have nothing by Papias about the Gospel of John. So once again, that's that odd confusion. Papias is talking at one point about wanting to hear the truth and wanting to talk to people who had actually known Jesus. And he mentions John, clearly meaning the son of Zebedee, and then a little later uses the phrase John the Elder. But he's not talking about the authorship of the gospel at that point. That's not the context. Now, you could say something important here comes out of it, which is Papias' commitment to literal truth. That sort of indirectly tells us something, which I think is very important, which is that all this talk about, ancient views of truth, and they didn't care as much about literal truth, all nonsense. Papias definitely cares about literal truth. So, in that sense, he tells us something about all the Gospels, which is that they were being received by this very ancient person, very close to the apostolic generation, as literal truth. That's important for debunking certain myths about the way ancient people thought, but we don't have a direct testimony. Now, you asked about the Anti-Marcionite Prologue. It's not, strictly speaking, impossible that Papias wrote down the gospel. I think John may have had a an amanuensis, which would be a secretary. I don't think that person was introducing new elements to the stories or anything. He would have just been writing down what John said. But the Anti-Marcionite Prologue seems to be talking about John rejecting Marcion, which is a problem as far as chronology is concerned. So at that point, I think something has gotten garbled in a sense. So while it could be true, I I have my doubts about it, but I'm very open to the idea that in a now lost work, Papias did say that the gospel was written by John, the beloved disciple, and so forth. He may very well have said that. It's just that we can't actually verify that with any kind of context or anything because we no longer have that work available to us.
would you point to as being the most important textual evidence within the Gospel of John that really shows it to have been written by an eyewitness and a disciple of Jesus?
So, it's really impossible to pick one thing. And this is why, as I said at the beginning, the most important reason is that there are so many reasons. So, for example, just little touches like when he says that Jesus went down to Capernaum, and a little bit later that the the royal official was going down, and the previous place is Cana, in both instances. And when you go from Cana to Capernaum, you do in fact walk, downhill. Now, that's just one little thing of dozens and dozens. That's the voice of a person who actually had walked it. It would be like my referring to the Shell station at the bottom of the hill, and if you live here in my town, in my part of town, you know about the Shell station at the bottom of the hill. So it's got that authentic voice. Or, for example, when he talks about the beloved disciple and Peter running to the tomb. The the ivory tower scholar gets this bizarre idea that it's an allegory of the competition between two different schools, a Johannine and a Petrine school in the early church. It's just complete nonsense. Instead, when you read it, it even has this narrative present. They're running to the tomb, and the disciple outran Peter, and he comes first, and he stoops down and looks in, but he doesn't go in, and then Peter comes, and Peter goes in, and it's almost awkward because it's got all these little starts and stops, and he didn't go in, and he did go in, and so forth. That's the way I tell stories. Okay. With those kinds of details, those vivid details of memory. So there's both external and internal things. For example, his reference to Caiaphas as being high priest that year, and to Annas as also being the high priest. There were skeptics who said, oh, that's nonsense because there could only be one high priest at a time. And then when you go over to Josephus, you compare that and you find that the Romans were, bringing in high priests, kicking out high priests, bringing in high priests, kicking out high priests. And so you could have two alive at the same time. It was no longer a lifetime role. And you even find Josephus using a plural of high priests, okay, um, very much in a way that indirectly, super indirectly, confirms John's use of the phrase, he was high priest that year. Just all these little things. It was such a complicated time as far as the relationship of Rome to the Jews. And these are hard things to get right. And it's clearly this Jew who's just completely immersed in that culture. And that's just the external part. And completely immersed in that place and that time. And then all this internal stuff too. The more you read, the more you find. And so that's why it's important not to confine ourselves to just one reason, but to see that variety of reasons and types of reasons. I do this in my book Testimonies to the Truth as well, which is smaller and has come out recently. Most recently, that's my most recent book. But if you just want to look into stuff about John, it would be The Eye of the Beholder.
And in my closing question, do you think that the author of the Gospel of John ever ran across the synoptics, or vice versa, the synoptics knew him, or they're just totally independent of one another?
So I definitely think it was written last. So in that sense, the synoptic authors would not have read the Gospel of John. They might have heard, some of the same things that aren't told until the time of the Gospel of John. We don't know. But I think John was familiar with the synoptics. I think that it would have been difficult for him not to be. Justin Martyr tells us that the memoirs, as he calls them, of the apostles were being read in the churches. So, and I also think, of course, that, John as a fellow disciple, they knew one another. In that sense, they're not quote unquote completely independent, where you have this model of independence where you're sort of locking people up in separate rooms, right? And they never even so much as heard of what each other are writing. But I've done a lot of professional work on independence in my publications, secular publications in philosophy. And you don't have to lock people up in separate rooms in order to have accounts that are independent in a very relevant sense. And what we're seeing here are accounts that are independent in the sense that one author is not thinking about the other author or trying to make what he writes fit or correspond. And we can tell this by what I talk about as apparent casualness, and by the completely indirect ways in which they confirm one another in what I refer to as undesigned coincidences. So, to give just one example, both John and the Synoptics tell about the feeding of the 5,000, but there are actually even apparent discrepancies between them. Now, I actually think in that case, those can be harmonized. I'm not an inerrantist. I think there are some apparent discrepancies that can't be harmonized, but I think in this case, these can be. Things like, did Jesus go and see the disciples off in their boat before he dismissed the crowd? These little trivial things. And John takes no trouble at all to try to smooth these out or make these fit together. That's a sign of the relevant type of independence. He's just telling his own story in his own way. And yet we get these indirect dovetailings. So Jesus asks Philip where they can buy bread. Elsewhere in John's gospel, completely different context, he mentions that Philip was from Bethsaida. Well, so what? Okay, he doesn't even mention that in connection with the feeding. Then you go way over to Luke, a third passage. Luke mentions that the feeding took place in the vicinity of Bethsaida. Okay, but John doesn't seem to have that in mind. He doesn't mention that it took place in the vicinity of Bethsaida. He doesn't say anything like that. So he doesn't appear to be trying to connect what he's doing with Luke by mentioning that Jesus had a conversation with Philip. Like there's no appearance of connection there. And yet when you put it all together, Jesus is actually kind of teasing them. Hey guys, hey Philip, where are we going to buy bread for all these people? Of course, he doesn't really mean they're going to buy bread for them. Why does he ask Philip? Well, because Philip is from near there. And so it comes together because reality comes together, but it's independent in the sense that John is not trying to make it come together. And that's the most important kind of independence of all. And that's why you get these very important mutual confirmations, many of them without any collusion or attempt to make it fit together at all. And that is there, even though I believe John was, yes, aware of the Synoptic Gospels and of their contents.
Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. McGrew.
Thanks for having me, Jacob.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.